All right, so now here's part two of my talk. All right, in part one we discussed that we are now in the midst of the failure of the attempts of 1929 to really cure the ails of capitalism of our commercial society. And in fact, I've always predicted that the problems that would come in the future would be worse. And if we now try to repair the same system, all we would be doing is building to a greater collapse yet in the future. And why? Well, what happens to a company when it can't make payroll? The very next day it disbands. Thus, the very integrity of that kind of a social organization, which is a corporation, is very much like quicksand. It is very fragile. It may seem that corporations are strong, but you see what happened on Wall Street, Merrill Lynch, Bear Stearns, all the big players there just collapsed. And they collapsed quickly. You know, back in 1929, you saw people standing online with a run to the banks. You know, it took hours, it took days to get their money back. Today, we do it instantaneously on computers. And that's why the crisis was so quick and why it was so urgent and why Congress had to act within days to prevent an entire meltdown of the global financial markets. And I call this a reductionism of time, as well as which means a shortening of the span of change, which means an acceleration of change. And it's a kind of consciousness that has evolved over the last 100 years, where we are reducing the focus of our consciousness to smaller and smaller units, and thus things happen more quickly. And this is really part and parcel of actually the worldview that was introduced in the 17th century. And why I have this perspective, and why I believe we need an entirely different social order in order to cure these problems, and none of this federal spending will really cure anything, is because early in my life I had in myself very deeply a change in worldviews. And it happened when I was 17 years old, and I had a meltdown. My left brain shut down because of a high fever, and I began to see the world in a right brain way, which I call a connective way. That actually what is our consciousness is the very essence of nature and not matter and energy defined mathematically, which was the 17th century worldview, which led to the Industrial Revolution. That actually it is our consciousness that forms within ourselves who we are, and it is the consciousness of nature that forms what nature is. And if we don't understand what that is, if we violate what that is, which is what we're doing now, nothing really substantial can be built. And then our health breaks down, our social order breaks down, and our environment around us breaks down. And we're seeing this, and it's masked because we don't realize how much this is really occurring, because our society also offers certain, you might say, consciousness drugs. We have so much entertainment available. We can watch a movie, sit at the TV, forget our troubles, and not really face the reality of the world we live in. One of those realities is that the single person living alone is now the largest growing segment of our population, which is an evidence of the disintegration of our social order. We see that we have single households are now outnumber those with couples with children. This has never occurred before in the history of our civilization, not in America, not in Canada, not in Europe. And it's occurring now as part of the pressures of the commercial world, a part of what I call separative consciousness. And what I learned when I had that experience at 17 years old was that consciousness actually splits in two fundamental directions. One is healing, the other is non-healing. One is away from the underlying consciousness of wholeness, the other is toward the underlying consciousness of wholeness. And if you learn how to gravitate toward those two directions in an integral way, then you can restructure the whole of your own consciousness, the whole of society, the whole of our relationships to our bodies, the whole of our relationships to our environment. And what we have today is an abortion. And the primary reason is the dominance of the mathematical worldview, because mathematics abstracts how to separate all elements of consciousness and is thus taking us away from ultimately an order that can build a firm and solid foundation for our social, ecological, and health order. And we see this also in many other signs. We see the level of social violence in inner cities. We see how many people are incarcerated in our society. America has the highest rate of incarceration of any country in the world. We basically separate out those elements that kind of are a threat to this commercial society, and that include the hippie movement of the 1960s, where anyone taking pot and trying to enter into some kind of a different state of consciousness was simply arrested, put in jail. That movement was stopped in its tracks in order to continue to develop what is the essence of our world. Not to say that I support taking any kinds of drugs, but it is just a reflection of how our society functions. There is a level of violence on the international arena as well. And so how do we form a different kind of society? Well, if consciousness forms the essence of who we are, and consciousness itself is the relationship of connection in nature, then we need to understand what is connective and separative. And one of the things that's not connective is what I call opposition, which is competition. Competition creates friction creates fire. Fire actually burns out our inner consciousness and does not evolve us as human beings. And so I'm a supporter of intentional communities that work cooperatively, that are focused on our own health, wholeness, and spiritual development. Everything that's connective in our consciousness, rather than a society based on commerce, based on competition, based on me against you, me for myself, based on the corruption of consciousness that a monetary society endeavors, based on the suffering and the stratification of rich against poor that a commercial society creates. And so we need a very, very deep revolution, really, in our whole understanding of the universe, and our understanding of ourselves, and that is the only thing that will fundamentally create a different direction for our society. Right now, what's happening is really a sham. We're not going to solve the unemployment problem. We're going to build to a further and deeper disintegration of our social order. I call it a social atomic bomb. You know, atomic bombs are based on the same model as the 17th century worldview, and we are, as it were, recreating that socially. It's very interesting historically to trace how this all evolved. For example, William Petty was one of the first economists on the planet. He was also a friend of Sir Isaac Newton. And as Sir Isaac Newton developed the theory that all of nature and all the stars rotate in a kind of clock-like mechanical way in cadence with mathematical law, William Petty thought, well, if that's the real depth, essence of how everything in the universe functions, then a social order should function that way also. And so he wrote a book called Political Mathematique, and it was one of the first books ever of economics, which showed how our social order should be, as it were, in harmony with the cosmic order. And in fact, that order that we've built is not in harmony with our cosmic order. And that's why also we have health pandemics today, because we don't understand who we are and what we are in this universe we live in. We need really a revolution in thought, what I call a global mind change, a movement toward higher consciousness, and then we can get through the deceptions of our society. What creates conditions that, you know, where you have drug-dependent seniors who are over 50% Alzheimer-ish, anyone over 85, over 50% of them drop into dementia and Alzheimer conditions, because we don't know what consciousness is, not within the chemical, mechanical worldview that was introduced in the 17th century. So these are serious issues. They're all intertwined, which is why I don't separate these issues in the discussion of raw wisdom. Thank you for listening. Please visit our website. It's called raw-wisdom.com. You'll get insights there you see nowhere else on the planet. Thank you.